The river smelled of mud and spring thaw, its banks slick with churned earth, as though the land itself had been ground down by the passing of too many boots. Dawn came pale and shivering, a mist dragging its white skirts across the Elbe, and through it came the columns, silent, endless, spectral. They moved like a river within a river, rifles hanging slack, helmets askew, boots worn through to leather tongues. Some walked as if in a trance, others with a dogged, mechanical rhythm, as though the act of marching was the only thing keeping them upright. At the head of one such column walked Captain Ernst Kruger, his greatcoat stained with weeks of retreat and rain. Once his regiment had been a spear point, proud and sharp. Now it was a blunt mass of stragglers and starving boys, no banners left to follow. His face was narrow, pinched from hunger, but his eyes were clear, fixed westward. He had not looked east in days. East was where the guns were. East was where the Soviets came, a tide of vengeance that swallowed whole divisions. Behind him limped Corporal Menzel, barely 20 and wrapped in a scarf that had belonged to his sister. He kept one hand on the small cart he pulled. Inside, 2 children slept, neighbors' orphans picked up somewhere near Stettin. They were not supposed to be there, but then nothing about this war was supposed to be like this. Once the army had fought for glory, for Hitler, for an idea of empire. Now it fought to keep these children alive long enough to hand them over to someone who would not kill them. The road was lined with more than soldiers. Civilians trudged alongside, farmers driving their last milk cow, women with shawls tied tight, boys too young for rifles but too old to be left behind. The war had spat them all out together, losers and victims alike, and now they moved west in one body, pulled by the same magnetic terror. Somewhere beyond that mist, beyond the fields that were greening with spring, the Americans waited. No one spoke much of what would happen if they failed to reach them. Everyone had heard stories of the Red Army. Houses burned, women dragged screaming into the night, old men shot against barn walls. Even the most stubborn veterans, those who had sworn never to surrender, now whispered the same word under their breath like a prayer. Americaner. It was no longer about ideology. It was about surviving this last, cruel season of war. As they neared a small village, they passed a ditch where the bodies of 2 German soldiers lay sprawled, still in their gray coats. The corpses were already stiff, their faces turned toward the rising sun, as if startled by what they saw there. Kruger looked once, then kept walking. He had long ago lost the habit of counting the dead. Menzel crossed himself quickly, almost furtively, as though God might not notice. The column halted briefly when they reached the old stone bridge that crossed a stream feeding the river. The bridge had been shelled days earlier, its parapet missing, its arch cracked but holding. Men crossed one at a time, boots clattering on the wet stones. On the far side, a man stumbled and fell to his knees. Someone laughed, a short, cracked laugh that sounded almost like a sob, and helped him up. The whole column seemed to breathe out at once. They had crossed something more than a bridge. In the stillness that followed, the first sound of distant artillery reached them. Low, rolling, a growl from the east. The men stiffened instinctively. Kruger raised his head, scanning the horizon. He knew the pace of armies, the rhythm of pursuit. The Soviets were coming faster now. There would be no long pauses, no gentle surrender. If they were caught, it would be at gunpoint, with blood on the road. "Keep moving," Kruger said, his voice flat but carrying. The words traveled down the line, repeated until even those at the rear quickened their step. There was no need for speeches. They all knew what was at stake. By midday the sky cleared, a thin sun breaking through to reveal the countryside in sharp detail. The greening hedgerows, the distant spires of a church, smoke rising from a farmhouse. For a moment it almost looked peaceful, almost like a country not at war. And then they saw the next wave of refugees cresting the road ahead, another column merging with theirs, hundreds more faces pinched with the same mixture of hope and fear. It seemed as though the entire eastern half of Germany was flowing toward this single river, drawn by some invisible current. A pair of American fighter planes appeared suddenly, slicing across the sky at low altitude. The column scattered instinctively, men diving into ditches, children shrieking. But the planes did not fire. They banked once, glittering in the sun, then roared westward again. When the men crawled out of the ditches, brushing mud from their coats, some were smiling for the first time in weeks. The Americans were close. Evening brought them to a wide meadow where they bivouacked, the grass pressed flat by hundreds of bodies. Fires were lit with the last scraps of wood. Someone found a goat and milked it into a battered tin cup, sharing it among the children first. Menzel sat staring into the flames, his face hollow with exhaustion. Kruger knelt beside him, checking the map by firelight. The Elba was still 2 days away, maybe 3 if the roads were clogged. He could hear more guns now, closer, like thunder stepping nearer with every hour. That night he dreamed of rivers. In the dream, the Elba was black and wide, and on the far bank stood a line of American soldiers in clean uniforms, their faces unreadable. Behind him the east burned red, and the roar of unseen tanks rolled ever closer. When he woke before dawn, the mist was back, coiling low over the meadow. The men were already rising, stamping life back into their legs. Kruger stood and looked east. The sky was just beginning to pale there, streaked with the faintest glow of fire. The war was coming behind them like a storm, and the road ahead was narrowing. He could almost feel the press of history's hands on his back, shoving him forward. By the time the column moved out again, the first Soviet shells were falling miles behind, their dull concussions rolling across the fields. Each one seemed to push the men faster, until the column was no longer marching but striding, almost running, driven by a single desperate thought: to reach the river before the east caught them. And somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the river, beyond all this ruin, the Americans were waiting, like the last open door in a house already on fire. Berlin was dying by inches, its streets clogged with smoke and plaster dust, its proud boulevards reduced to crooked canyons of rubble. The Reich Chancellery, once the seat of Hitler's dominion, had become a bunker, a tomb with electric lights. Deep below ground, the Führer paced maps that no longer matched the real world, ordering armies that no longer existed to attack phantom enemies. His voice, once electric, now sounded like a man shouting into an empty room. Above him, the last defenders of Berlin fought with Panzerfausts in alleys and gardens, boys who had not yet learned to shave. Each day they fell in the hundreds, leaving their weapons stacked like kindling for the next doomed wave. Far from the capital, Ernst Kruger felt the death throes of the Reich ripple through every village his column passed. Posters with Hitler's face flapped on cracked walls, his gaze hollowed by soot. Propaganda still blared from radios, final victory, secret weapons, but no one believed it. Mothers listened only for the rumble of distant guns. Fathers dug shallow shelters in back gardens. The Reich was collapsing not with a single great shattering blow, but in a long, rolling crumble, as if its bones had gone soft. Kruger had fought since the first days of the war, through Poland, France, and Russia, and he knew the sound of an army unraveling. It was not the roar of battle that haunted him now, but the silence after. Villages stood empty, their doors hanging open. Horses lay dead in harness on the roadside, already stripped for meat. There was no supply line, no front line, only the knowledge that somewhere to the east, Soviet tanks were churning closer with a kind of terrible inevitability. He remembered the old maps where the German front had once been a bold red line, thrust deep into the Soviet Union. Now that line was broken glass, splintered and pointing home. His men did not speak of victory. They spoke of the Elba, of the Americans, of surviving the next week. When he passed them on the march, Kruger could see their thoughts etched in their faces, a single wordless question hanging in the air. How much farther west could they go before they ran out of road? At night, around low fires, the men spoke in murmurs of the stories filtering back from the east. Farms torched, towns emptied, women dragged screaming into the dark. Some were exaggerations, some true, but together they painted a single picture. The Red Army was coming not as a conqueror, but as an avenger. Every German soldier knew what had been done in Russia: burned villages, mass graves, the starvation of cities, and every man feared the debt coming due. Menzel kept his eyes on the children whenever such talk began, tightening the scarf around his neck as though bracing against a wind. The children had grown quiet since joining the column, no longer crying, their eyes large and solemn. They clutched one another and watched the soldiers with an animal wariness, as though sensing that these men, strangers with guns, were their only shield against something even worse. Menzel had begun walking closer to Kruger, as though proximity to his captain could protect them all. Each day seemed to strip away another layer of the Reich's illusions. They passed through a town where a Nazi banner still hung across the square, its swastika bright against the gray ruin. Under it, an old man lay dead beside a cart of household goods, his body half covered with a blanket. No one stopped to move him. The war had taught them to keep moving, to leave graves where they fell. On the third day, Kruger's regiment, if it could still be called that, met a stream of retreating tanks, their turrets blackened by soot, their crews riding exposed on the hulls. The tank commander saluted grimly and shouted that the Soviets were less than 30 kilometers behind. "They are not taking prisoners," he added before his column clattered on, heading west at full speed. The words passed down Kruger's line like a chill, quickening their pace. The spring fields around them seemed obscene in their freshness, a green too bright for this dying world. Somewhere birds were singing, but even that sounded distant like a memory. The men walked faster, sweat darkening their tunics, as if they could outrun the season itself. Each step carried them farther from the war they had waged and closer to the war they were now fighting. The war to choose their captors. When they bivouacked that evening, Kruger called his sergeants together. By firelight their faces looked carved from wood, hollowed by sleeplessness. He told them what they already knew. They must reach the Elbe before the Soviets cut them off. They would move at first light and march until their legs gave out. No stragglers, no halts. The sergeants nodded, their silence a kind of oath. Later, as he lay with his back against a tree, Kruger took out the letter he had written but never sent to his wife. The paper was damp, the ink smudged, but he read the words again by memory. He told her that the war was lost, that all he could do now was bring as many of his men as possible into American hands. He did not write of what might happen if they failed. He folded the letter carefully and put it away. At dawn the next day, they passed a column of Volkssturm, old men and boys armed with mismatched rifles, heading east. The sight was so absurd it drew a bitter laugh from one of Kruger's lieutenants. These last-ditch troops marched with blank faces, as though they knew they were marching to their deaths but could think of no alternative. One of them, a boy no older than 16, raised his hand in a weary salute. Menzel returned it automatically, then looked away. The sound of Soviet artillery began just before noon, faint but distinct, rolling across the sky like distant thunder. It seemed to follow them all afternoon, growing a little louder with each hour. The column moved faster, the men breathing hard, eyes darting eastward. Even the civilians seemed to sense the urgency, dragging their carts at a near trot. By evening they reached the outskirts of another ruined town. The church tower was half gone, its bell lying cracked in the street. Smoke still rose from some of the houses, the air bitter with it. Kruger halted the column just long enough to send scouts ahead. When they returned, they reported that the main road west was choked with traffic, retreating soldiers, refugee carts, even livestock. It would take hours to pass through. Kruger looked once at the sky, at the last light bleeding away behind the clouds. He felt the nearness of the Eastern Front like heat at his back. Somewhere, beyond that dark horizon, the Soviet columns were moving too, closing the gap mile by mile. He gave the order to push on through the night. The men groaned softly but obeyed, tightening their belts and adjusting their rifles. Lanterns were lit, throwing long, quivering shadows across the road. The column stepped forward into the dark, their boots striking a steady rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. And somewhere behind them, as if to drive them on, a single shell exploded in the distance, a flash that lit the eastern sky for an instant, reminding them all that they were being hunted, and that the night would not hide them for long. The march became a thing beyond orders, beyond reason, a living current sweeping men, women, and carts westward as if pulled by invisible ropes. Day after day, the road grew more crowded, until it was no longer a column, but a river of humanity. Every face turned toward the Elbe like sunflowers seeking light. What had once been an army was now a procession. Soldiers with rifles slung muzzle down, horses gaunt and foaming, civilians clutching bundles of bread and bedding. The pace was brutal, but none complained. To stop was to be overtaken. Kruger walked at the front, scanning every bend for signs of roadblocks, Soviet scouts, or American patrols. His boots were cracked from weeks of retreat, but he pressed on with the steady endurance of a man who knew that each mile gained was a small reprieve from judgment. Behind him, Menzel tugged the children's cart over the rutted ground, his hands blistered, his jaw clenched. He had begun speaking softly to them as they walked, naming rivers and towns as if reciting a prayer. Elbe, Magdeburg, Tangermund. They listened with wide eyes, absorbing these names like charms that might keep the world from ending. The landscape itself seemed to echo their desperation. Bridges sagged where they crossed them, their stones blackened by shelling. Fields were trampled, strewn with abandoned helmets and broken wagons. They passed burned villages where the air still smelled of smoke, and sometimes in the ditches lay the unburied dead, German, Soviet, civilian, reduced to shapes that no one dared linger over. The men looked straight ahead, boots squelching in the mud, pretending not to see. And yet, amid this ruin, the march took on its own rhythm, almost ceremonial. When they encountered other units, they merged without question, as if all of Germany were flowing into one last army of surrender. Sometimes the road was so crowded that movement slowed to a crawl, and Kruger would lift his field glasses to the horizon, searching for danger. Once, he saw a Soviet reconnaissance vehicle crest a distant hill, silhouetted against the pale sky. The column broke into a near panic, scattering into hedgerows, ready to fight if they must. But the vehicle turned away, vanishing into the distance. When the soldiers returned to the road, they moved twice as fast, sweat streaming down their faces. At midday, they crossed paths with a group of Waffen-SS men, their black uniforms dusty but still severe, their faces expressionless. The regular army troops tensed, watching them warily. For years they had fought shoulder to shoulder, but now, in this twilight of defeat, old rivalries sharpened. The SS men marched with a rigidness that felt defiant, as though refusing to admit that the war was lost. Kruger said nothing, only tightened his grip on his rifle and kept his men moving. Later, around a cooking fire, one of the sergeants muttered that those men would rather die fighting the Soviets than lay down their arms. "Let them," Kruger replied. "Their fight buys us time." As night fell, the march did not stop. Lanterns bobbed along the road, their light glinting off helmets, off the wet eyes of horses. The sound of boots and hooves became a lullaby of exhaustion, hypnotic, endless. Somewhere in the dark, a child began to cry, the sound startling in its rawness. Menzel scooped the child up, carrying him against his chest until the sobbing quieted. In that moment, he felt less a soldier than a shepherd, guiding not just himself but a future he barely understood toward safety. On the fourth day, they reached a crossroads where the road west was blocked by a knot of vehicles. Trucks, carts, even a captured Soviet tank abandoned when its fuel ran dry. The column bunched up dangerously, a mass of exposed bodies under a sky that could bring planes at any moment. Kruger ordered a detour through the fields, the men fanning out to keep their distance. It was slow going, mud sucking at their boots, but at last they regained the road beyond the jam. When they looked back, they saw the distant flash of artillery fire landing near the crossroads they had just left. The column went silent, each man absorbing the narrowness of their escape. By the next afternoon, the first rumors reached them. American patrols had been seen near the Elbe. One man swore he had glimpsed a star-spangled flag flying over a farmhouse. The effect was electric. The column seemed to gain strength, shoulders straightening, feet quickening despite the blisters. Even the children sensed the change, sitting up in the cart, eyes bright. Kruger allowed himself a single deep breath, the first he had taken in days that did not feel like drowning. Still, the Soviets were coming closer. They could hear it now even when they rested. Dull thuds rolling through the earth, the crackle of distant gunfire. The front was no longer a line but a shadow falling over them, and every hour that passed without contact felt like a miracle. Menzel caught sight of a farm girl standing at a fence, watching the procession with a look that was neither fear nor welcome, but something like pity. It struck him harder than any shell. They were a defeated people, and even the young could see it. That evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, they bivouacked in an orchard. The apple trees were in bloom, petals falling like snow, their sweetness at odds with the stench of sweat and gun oil. Some men lay staring up through the branches, as though wondering if they would live to see another spring. Kruger walked the perimeter, checking sentries, then stood at the edge of the orchard looking east. The sky was darkening, but there was a faint glow far off, a smear of fire on the horizon where villages were burning. He thought of Berlin, of the boys still fighting among its ruins, and felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. He had chosen his path, and it led west. When the column moved again at dawn, the road had become almost festive with traffic. Columns of infantry, lines of wagons, even groups of civilians carrying white cloths tied to sticks. The whole countryside seemed to be in motion, everyone flowing toward the same destination. The air was tense but electric, like the hour before a storm breaks. By midday they reached a ridge, and from its crest they saw, at last, the gleam of water in the distance. The Elbe, wide gray, winding through the countryside like a silver blade. For a moment the column halted, stunned into silence by the sight. Then someone began to laugh, a wild, relieved laugh that rippled down the line until even Kruger smiled grimly. The river was still miles away, but now it was real, no longer just a word passed down the column like a prayer. And somewhere beyond that ribbon of water, Faint but unmistakable, they heard the drone of engines, American vehicles moving on the far bank. The sound rolled across the fields like a promise, and the men gripped their rifles tighter, ready to march faster. The race was nearly over, but the finish line was not yet theirs. The riverbank was a tangle of bodies, living, breathing, waiting bodies, spilling down to the water's edge. They stood in clusters, sat on kit bags, lay back in the grass staring up at the sky as though willing time to pass. The Elbe flowed cold and indifferent before them, a gray mirror reflecting their exhaustion. On the far bank stood a scattering of American outposts, their jeeps parked at angles, soldiers watching through binoculars. The two worlds faced one another across the water, not as enemies, but as players waiting for the cue to begin the final act. Kruger felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest as he looked down the slope at his men. They were no longer an army, but a collection of individuals stitched together by shared desperation. Some had cleaned themselves as best they could, combing hair, straightening tunics, even polishing boots with spit and rags. Others sat hollow-eyed, staring at the river as if it might dissolve and swallow them. In their faces Kruger saw pride, shame, and an almost childlike hope, all of it bound by fear that the Soviets would reach them first. Menzel crouched near the cart, feeding the children from the last of their bread. The crusts were hard, but the children chewed silently, watching the soldiers with solemn fascination. One of them, the girl with plaited hair, reached up and touched Menzel's sleeve. "Are we safe now?" she whispered. He hesitated, glancing toward the far shore where an American flag stirred in the breeze. "Almost," he said softly, though the word felt fragile, as if the wind might blow it away. As the hours passed, more columns arrived, swelling the mass at the riverbank until it seemed the whole of Germany had gathered there. Prisoner cages were being prepared on the western side, makeshift enclosures of barbed wire, rows of tents, field kitchens. But for now the Germans waited, neither free nor captured. Somewhere in the throng a man began to sing, a low, mournful song from the trenches of the last war. Others joined in until the air trembled with it, a lament for a country that no longer existed. Late in the afternoon, a pair of Soviet shells landed in the woods behind them. The explosions threw dirt high into the air and sent birds wheeling in panic. Panic rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Soldiers grabbed rifles, civilians dragged carts toward the river, children wailed. Kruger shouted orders, forcing his men into a defensive line facing east. For several tense minutes they waited, but no Soviet troops appeared, only the distant rumble of artillery. It was enough. The message was clear, time was running out. When the first American boat crossed to fetch them, the crush toward the water was almost uncontrollable. Officers barked commands, trying to impose some semblance of order, but the fear was stronger than discipline. Kruger grabbed Menzel by the shoulder and shoved him forward, the children clutching the sides of the cart. "You go first," he said. Menzel opened his mouth to protest, but Kruger's expression silenced him. He knew the captain would stay to the last man if necessary. The boat rocked under the weight of its human cargo, but the Americans said nothing, their faces impassive as they guided it back across the current. Menzel held the children close, feeling their small hearts hammering against his chest. When they stepped onto the far bank, he let out a long breath, one he had been holding since the retreat began. For the first time in weeks, he believed they might actually live. On the near bank, Kruger watched the boat land, watched his men step into captivity with something like dignity. More boats crossed, more men boarded, the river steadily devouring the remnants of the army he had once commanded. Each crossing felt like a page being torn from a book, the story of the Wehrmacht ending one boatload at a time. As night fell, the sky lit with fires behind them, the Soviets drawing closer, burning villages as they came. The glow painted the river red, and in that light Kruger saw the faces of his remaining men, saw the terrible knowledge that they might not all make it across before the Soviets arrived. He turned to the last group, those too weary to stand, those with wounds bound in filthy rags. "Up," he said quietly. "We go now." The final crossing was chaos. Shells booming closer, tracer fire streaking across the horizon, the shouts of officers drowned out by the roar of engines. The boat was overloaded, sitting low in the water, but still they crammed aboard. As they pushed off, Kruger stood in the prow, his coat whipping in the wind, staring back at the burning east. For a heartbeat it seemed the entire war was condensed into that single moment. The darkness behind, the faint light ahead, the river between. Halfway across, a Soviet shell landed near the bank they had just left, sending up a column of mud and water. The men flinched but kept rowing, their muscles straining. When they reached the far side, American MPs waved them toward the holding area. Kruger stumbled onto the shore, feeling the weight slide from his shoulders all at once. His knees nearly buckled, but he caught himself and looked back one last time. The eastern horizon glowed like a forge, and in its red glare he saw the silhouettes of more figures arriving at the river's edge, too late. The Americans herded the new prisoners into the enclosure, handing out water and rations. Kruger moved among his men, clapping shoulders, speaking quietly, taking stock. Menzel found him near the edge of the cage, the children asleep on a blanket. "We made it," he said simply. Kruger nodded, though his eyes stayed on the river. In the distance, the sound of Soviet guns rolled again, but now it seemed muffled, far away, as though coming from another world. For the first time, Kruger allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to feel the tremor in his hands. Around him, thousands of men settled into the strange stillness of captivity, some staring blankly, others weeping in relief. And as the night deepened, as the fires on the eastern horizon painted the clouds a blood red, Kruger thought of Berlin, of the bunker far to the east where Hitler raged against ghosts, and felt no grief that the old world was dying. They had crossed the river. They had chosen their captors. And whatever came next, it would be written on this side of the water. Morning broke soft and golden over the prisoner cages, the light spilling across the barbed wire like threads of fire. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling as though the earth itself were celebrating the war's ending. Yet within the enclosure, men stirred slowly, cautiously, as if still half expecting to be woken by orders, by shellfire, by the bark of sergeants telling them to move. The silence was almost unnerving. For years they had lived by the drumbeat of war, and now there was only the rustle of canvas, the cough of a guard lighting his cigarette, the muted splash of the river beyond. Kruger rose from where he had been sitting against the fence, his coat drawn around him, and stretched until his back cracked. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tension easing from his bones, like ice breaking under spring sun. Around him, his men began to stand, to wash their faces in tin cups, to speak in low voices. There was no joy, but there was something steadier. The realization that they were alive, that the long flight west had ended here, and they had not been overtaken by the storm behind them. Menzel appeared from the far end of the cage, the children following close, their hair damp from sleep. He handed Kruger a crust of bread from the rations the Americans had given them. "They say we will be moved again tomorrow," Menzel said. His voice held neither fear nor hope, just the flat acceptance of a man whose fate was no longer in his own hands. Kruger nodded, chewing slowly, tasting the grain and salt as if they were the first real flavors he had known in years. Beyond the wire, the Americans moved with practiced efficiency, setting up more tents, unloading supplies. Their voices were calm, almost casual, as though this mass of defeated men were merely another problem to be solved before nightfall. One soldier even offered cigarettes through the fence, grinning as the prisoners crowded forward to take them. The war between them was over, and yet Kruger could feel the invisible gulf that still yawned between victor and vanquished. That afternoon, word spread that the Soviets had reached the far bank of the Elbe. From the cage, Kruger watched the eastern horizon, half expecting to see columns of tanks appear on the ridges. Instead there was only the river, wide and calm, dividing two worlds. He realized then that their crossing had been not just an escape, but a kind of rebirth. Everything they had been, soldiers of a Reich that no longer existed, had been left on the other side. What stepped ashore here were not warriors, but men stripped down to the core of their humanity, their survival. As the sun sank, the sky turned to hammered copper, and the river caught the light like a sheet of molten metal. The prisoners gathered at the fence, staring as if hypnotized. Even the children grew still, their faces lit with orange glow. It was as though the entire east was aflame, and perhaps it was. Fires still burned in villages behind the Soviet lines, pillars of smoke rising to stain the twilight. The war was ending, but its last fury was not yet spent. Kruger stood among his men, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and felt the weight of years pressing on him. He thought of the campaigns he had fought, the roads marched, the comrades buried. All of it had led to this moment, to this quiet field where he stood unarmed and watched the world turn beneath a sky the color of blood. He felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a strange solemnity, as though he were witnessing not the defeat of an army, but the funeral of an age. Menzel joined him, the children asleep once more near the blanket. "Do you think we will go home soon?" he asked quietly. Kruger considered the question, though there was no answer to give. Home itself might no longer exist, bombed or burned or claimed by another flag. "Someday," he said at last. The word sounded both distant and inevitable. Night came swift and cold, the stars hard and bright overhead. The men lay in their blankets, murmuring, dreaming, some weeping softly. Kruger remained awake, listening to the hum of generators, to the far-off pop of gunfire as the last battles were fought miles away. He felt as though he were standing on a threshold, one foot in the dying war, the other in a future too vast to see. Sometime past midnight, a convoy of American trucks rumbled by on the road beyond the camp, their headlights slicing through the dark. Kruger watched them pass, watched the dust settle behind them, and understood that the world was already moving on, already rearranging itself into new lines, new alliances. The war they had known would soon be history, and they, those who had survived, would be its witnesses. When dawn returned, pale and clear, the guards opened the gate and ordered the prisoners to prepare for transport. The men gathered their few belongings, their movements slow but steady. Kruger helped Menzel lift the children into a waiting truck, then climbed up himself, gripping the side rail as the engine growled to life. He looked back one last time at the river, now silver in the morning light, quiet and still as if it had never been a frontier at all. The trucks rolled west, past fields shining with dew, past villages just beginning to stir. Kruger felt the wind on his face, cold and clean, carrying away the stench of smoke and war. Around him, the men sat silent, each lost in his own thoughts. The road unspooled before them, winding into the unknown. And as the cage and the river faded behind them, Kruger felt something inside him settle. A final surrender, not to the Americans, not to fate, but to time itself. Whatever they had been, whatever they had done, was over. The world ahead might judge them, but it would also offer them a chance, however small, to begin again. The convoy crested a hill, and the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the road with gold. For a moment, Kruger let himself believe that this was not just the end of a war, but the start of something else. The men squinted into the light, blinking as though waking from a long, terrible dream, the silhouettes of soldiers dissolving into the figures of ordinary men on the road home. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.